right now on the 2011 Raiders Draft Special. The silver and black are nearly back. A bevy of brilliant picks in 2010 helped rebuild a proud franchise. Now, the commitment to excellence continues with this year's process. Without a first-round pick, thanks to the addition of Richard Seymour, the Raiders look for diamonds in the rough. We're uncovering gems and telling you what positions the Raiders need to fill on the road to a championship. Get ready to feel the draft. The Oakland Raiders Draft Special starts now. In 2010, it was an 8-8 season for the Oakland Raiders. It's the offseason, and they hope to make themselves a playoff team in 2011. How you doing, everyone? Welcome to our Raiders Draft Preview Show. I'm Jim Kozimor, and by my side from CSNCalifornia.com, he's our Raiders insider, Paul Gutierrez. And, Paul, you take a look at what the Raiders have upcoming in the draft. You see no first-round pick. They traded it a couple of years ago for Richard Seymour. Was it a smart move?
Well, it's the knee-jerk reaction to it to me is yes, it was. It was a good move because you're getting a future Hall of Famer in Richard Seymour. You're getting a known commodity, and that trumps anything in the draft because you don't know what these guys are going to do. You don't know if they're going to pan out or not. The flip side of that, though, is you got to wait and you got to grade a draft 3 years down the road because you don't know exactly what you're going to get from that pick. But it's a much more expensive, dicey proposition with Richard Seymour. He's going to get $22.5 million guaranteed, potentially 30. That number 17 overall pick is going to be a lot cheaper than that. If they go to the playoffs, absolutely great thing. If they don't, I don't know.
If you review the Raiders' 2010 draft, you come away saying 2010, it was a very good year for the Raiders. Not just guys who started, but an impact guy in the linebacker, Rolando McClain.
Yeah, you look at what the Raiders did last year, and everybody on their mock drafts had the Raiders taking Bruce Campbell with that first-round pick. And really, they made a smart draft pick. They picked the best linebacker in college football, Rolando McClain. Now, he wasn't so much an up-and-down season last year. He was steady. But how impressive is that for a rookie to be back of the defense? And then on the edge there, you had Lamar Houston starting basically every game out there on the edge. You would have liked to see a lot more sacks from Lamar Houston out there, but he was a presence. He made a name for himself out there. So those top two guys right there, pretty impressive for the Raiders to get those guys.
And you look overall at the defense and how many guys have been drafted by this organization and have gone on to be starters on the defensive side. You'd have to say the Raiders have done well for themselves.
Yeah, and that's what they're kind of getting back to what the Raiders' philosophy is about, beating people up and taking no prisoners and you know, doing things like that. So defensively, they've had some pretty good drafts the past few years.
Offensive side of the ball, there are some names here that are very intriguing. Right. Zach Miller has gone on to have a great tight end career so far. Pro Bowl player. And you can probably throw Jacoby Ford's name somewhere in that mix.
Yeah, the thing about Jacoby Ford is it took a little while for the Raiders to figure out exactly how to use him. He's a definite Al Davis draft pick kind of guy, the fastest guy at the combine. And when they finally let him become the full-time kick returner, 3 kickoff returns for touchdowns. I mean, the most exciting player on the field out there at times. He won that game for the Raiders against Kansas City with his brilliance as a wide receiver, returning a kickoff for a touchdown. So this is a guy that the Raiders are definitely pinning a lot of hopes on. And you could actually see him potentially returning punts next year as well.
There is some offseason news that could very much impact the way the Raiders look at the 2011 draft. Nnamdi Asomugha. The story about Nnamdi and whether or not he comes back, I don't know if there's a sliver for him to come back, but how does it affect the Raiders' needs?
If he doesn't come back, and I have a hard time believing he will come back because of that huge contract they gave to Stanford Routt at the other cornerback position, then the Raiders definitely have to look at what they're going to do in the secondary. You know, but by the other side of that coin, they also have Jeremy Ware and Walter McFadden, 2 young guys they drafted last year. Ware didn't play much. McFadden had his baptism by fire against the Miami Dolphins last year. Didn't play much after that. So if they don't trust these 2 youngsters to come up there with Stanford Routt and Chris Johnson, then yeah, they may have to look at that.
I'm going to go dangerous on you right now because I'm going to read some tea leaves for the Raiders and try to figure out what they could do. You have a new head coach in Hugh Jackson, offensive guy. Yes. So you start to look forward at the draft and say, what offensive guy do you think fits perfectly for the Silver and Black?
It fits almost too perfectly because Hugh Jackson wants to become more of a power running team. Stefan Wisniewski's out there at Penn State. If he's still there at number 48 overall, then the Raider fans are going to go bananas because this is the guy they need. He's mean, he's nasty, he's athletic. He can play center and left guard, and with Robert Gallery gone, that's exactly what they're going to have to fill a hole with there. And oh yeah, he's Steve Wisniewski's nephew, so he knows a little bit something. At the Combine, Stefan Wisniewski was asked about the potential of playing for his uncle, who was the assistant offensive line coach for the Raiders, and he basically said that it would be a dream come true.
Great job, Paul. Thanks for the insight. You can read Paul Gutierrez all the time, CSNCalifornia.com. He's our Raiders insider. Over the years, the Raiders have had their share of good to great selections in the NFL draft. Among them, you look at Lamar Houston, Jared Veldheer, Jacoby Ford just last year. Lower round guys, non-first round guys who've done a great job. Welcome back to the Raiders Draft Preview Special. Who will be next on that draft hit list for the Oakland Raiders? We bring in Adam Kaplan from FoxSports.com. Adam, we think the Raiders' primary need is the offensive line. Who are some of the guys that you see being a good fit with the Oakland Raiders? Their first pick now, not until the second round.
Yeah, and remember, they've got really three needs in the offensive line. Center, you could take one of the tackle spots and one of the guard spots. So I think you mentioned Veldheer at the top. He turned out to be a real surprising pick, did a great job. He was a little bit ahead of the curve. It was a little surprising last year, but with Samson Satelli's free agency issue up in the air, they don't know if he'll be back, and Mario Henderson at right tackle. So I think at tackle, there are a couple guys that you could look at. I think Marcus Cannon and Orlando Franklin. Cannon's an interesting guy from TCU, who blocked for Andy Dalton. And then at center, Stefan Wisniewski, Steve Wisniewski's son. Of course, Steve Wisniewski is back with the Raiders this year as an offensive line coach. But I think Rodney Hudson, the Florida State center, probably would be the best pick for them because I think he's really ready and he's very athletic. The Raiders are looking for some athletic players. Then Danny Watkins, who's a guard. The only problem with him is he turns 27 this fall. It's hard to take a guy in the second round who you think he could play. He can only play for you 3 or 4 years, so that's always a concern. So I think those are some of the guys they could look at on the offensive line.
For the Raiders on the defensive side of the ball, there are some questions about Nnamdi Asomugha and whether or not the Raiders are going to be able to bring him back. So let's look at defensive back. Anyone in the second or the third round who you think might be a fit?
Yeah, in fact, here's a guy that I think the Raiders will like because they love speed, and you know about Stanford Route and how Al Davis loves guys who could run. I think that Davin House, the corner from New Mexico State, who had a phenomenal pro day, he ran in, one of the best 40 times I've seen in years for a DB in the 4.3s. He's a guy who's going to go second or third round, could go second. I think the Raiders would love to get him. There are a bunch of corners, developmental guys like Brandon Burton from Utah, Razai Dowling from Virginia. The problem with Dowling is he's had a lot of injuries, but I think a guy that they'd really like is Curtis Brown from Texas, who's going to be a rock-solid second-round pick. Remember, the Raiders are a mostly man scheme, and Brown is one of the better man corners in this draft. I think he'd be a good pick, and he also did very well at the Senior Bowl.
All right, well, we've already gotten our Raiders expert opinion on this one from Paul Gutierrez, but what do you think the Raiders, what about them trading away their first-round pick a couple of years ago and acquiring Richard Seymour? Good move or bad move for them?
You know, it turned out to be a good move. He had about 60% of the defensive snaps last year, 73 2 years ago, and he's a guy who's been very versatile, could play inside or outside on the defensive line. I think it's been worth it because you look at what he's been able to do for them, given some stability. And remember, they signed him to a 3-year deal extension right before the transaction deadline of March 4th. So, you know what? It turned out to be the right move.
For the Raiders, they had a very successful 2010 draft. In fact, they've been successful in the draft the last couple of years. They've been able to find some pieces. In your opinion, what has happened strategically that's allowed them to have such success in the draft?
Here's the thing. I know that people are saying that, well, maybe Al Davis is listening to his people more. You have to remember, when Cameron Wembley was traded, sources told me that the coaches did not know about it until after the trade was over. Mike Mitchell's pick, coaches didn't find out until the pick was in. So bottom line is, I think Al Davis is still making these picks, but he's just making better decisions. He isn't going for just the fast guy. He's actually going with guys who really could come in and play. And when you do that, you make better decisions for the long term. I think Al Davis is actually finally making good decisions.
Good stuff. Thanks for joining us, Adam. All right, Russ. Well, now, as all Raiders fans are saying, enough with those darn Broncos. What about the silver and black? What are Oakland's biggest needs? What do you see them doing? No first-round pick. They got to wait through the second round. How do the Raiders approach it this year?
Well, I think they're going to try to get a guy who's a quality player. I think quarterback is definitely a player they might look at, whether it's a Jake Locker or a Colin Kaepernick. I think also they'd love to get an offensive tackle. I think if a Gabe Karimi from Wisconsin or a Derek Sherrod from Mississippi State were available, I think they'd like to get a guy. That way they could get a good left tackle in there for the future. They wouldn't have to worry about whatever quarterback they get protecting his blind side. Also, a name to keep in mind, if Jimmy Smith, the cornerback out of Colorado, slips through to them, he's an elite corner prospect. Some teams have him the #1 corner on the board ahead of Patrick Peterson, but he has a lot of character concerns. And we all know Al Davis has shown a real willingness to look over character to take elite players. He could be their pick in the 2nd round.
If you look at the totality of your answers, both times you mentioned quarterback. So what I want you to do is take the top 8 quarterback prospects that you like, and how do you see them fitting in, whether it's the Raiders in a mid to late round situation?
Well, I think when you look at the quarterbacks for the Raiders, I mean, if they're going to take a guy in the 2nd round, it would be a Locker, it would be a Colin Kaepernick. But I think after those first few, you're going to be looking at mid to late round guys. You're going to be looking at guys like a Nathan Enderle from Idaho. He's a big athletic kid with a rocket arm and great mechanics. He just has bad accuracy, doesn't always make the best decisions. And then a real intriguing guy I think that the Raiders could get late round, Pat Devlin out of Delaware. Great mechanics, very accurate thrower. Needs a lot of work in terms of the jump up from being at Delaware to the NFL. But he has a lot of really good tools to work with, especially a late-round guy like that. Could really pay benefits down the road.
Russ, we appreciate the time. Thank you very much for your insights. Jason Campbell will almost certainly be the man under center for the Raiders, but who will back him up? Will that man be drafted by the Raiders, and who might that be? Questions get answered. We welcome you back to our Oakland Raiders Draft Preview Special. Those were all first-rounders. As we know, the Raiders don't have a first-rounder this year. For more on that, we welcome in Tony Pauline, SportsIllustrated.com's draft analyst, and he's also the man over at DraftInsider.com. Tony, the consensus is that the Raiders need an offensive lineman, but as we all know, the Raiders don't always pick exactly what they need. Do you think they'll draft for need this year, or will they be lured by that beautiful athlete that they look at, they see the numbers and they love them?
No, I think with so many needs on the offensive line, that's the way they're going to stick. The one exception could be is if a top-rated cornerback, say a Jimmy Smith of Colorado who's falling down boards, or possibly an Aaron Williams of Texas is available to them or starting to slide towards them, they may take that sort of player to kind of safeguard against what people see as the inevitable loss of Nnamdi Asamoah.